The Janitor Must Die. Read by the author, John Fulton. Chapter 3. Fight or Flight. Fluttering doves filled Josh's vision. He was standing in a bell tower, admiring the view. It seemed vaguely familiar, though he couldn't tell why. Every time he tried to focus on some detail far below, things seemed to get fuzzy. The bell tower was ringing. It had been ringing for hours, but he hadn't noticed until just a second ago. He pushed his hands against his head to keep it from flying apart. He could feel his heartbeat hammering the inside of his skull. He squeezed his eyes shut and tried to block out the music. The pounding beat flashed through his brain, illuminating the crowd around him. Subwoofer stacks taller than his head stood high over a sea of hands. Beating against his chest like the tides of the sea sped up 1,000-fold. The speaker grew larger, consuming and blotting out the light around them like a megalithic black hole. He couldn't remember why his ears were burning until he saw her face. Not shocked as she had been in the hall, but laughing, hair flying. Something was off. It wasn't a pure replay. Something was... "Why did you hit me?" he said. Someone grabbed his shoulder, spun him around, and punched him in the jaw. The earth shook, and he fell against something hard in the dark. The door burst open. He tumbled out into the brightness of a hallway and landed hard. He rolled onto his side with a grunt. The wind was strong, and the lights were flickering. He tried to get his bearings in the half-light, but all he could hear was the wind. People were running past him, screaming, dropping things, shouting orders. He tried to stand, but the world went bright and blurry, and he crouched down again. A blonde scientist screamed something at him in passing and then dashed down the hall. He stared after her, tasted metal, and touched his lip. It was bleeding. Down the hall to his right, the lights started popping out in showers of sparks, plunging the hallway into darkness. A flash of light was marked by a sound like a bomb had gone off, and a cloud of dust billowed out of the dark. There was another flash, and Josh saw a massive, jagged hole at the end of the hallway, eating its way towards him. The roar of a hurricane blasted against his skin. He suddenly felt like a man on a ship at sea, as if gravity had suddenly switched directions. Up, down, sideways. He screamed and threw himself down the hall, away from the howling maw. Half running, half climbing. This has got to be a dream, he thought. Foster yanked the fire alarm, and instantly an ear-piercing wail shot through the base, so loud he could feel it pounding against his chest. He refocused his attention to his partner, who was quickly shoving Nora down the hallway. He dashed to catch up. His partner turned to him and shouted, her voice muffled by the mask. "Any others?" "I didn't see any," Foster replied. He turned and began walking backwards, covering the pair. "Son of a bitch!" he spat. "We were this close!" His earpiece coughed. "Full report, Foster. What the hell's going on down there?" "They did it, sir. The singularity's active." "How wide?" The far end of the hallway started peeling away, wind rushing over them. "At least 100 feet and growing," Foster shouted. "You'd better get down here, boss." The hallway was plunged into darkness, and Foster heard the sounds of electronic equipment beeping and powering down. "God damn it," he cursed, and clicked his weapon light on. Only halfway sure of which direction was up, Josh scrambled through a corridor suddenly flooded with heavy red emergency lighting. Catching a glimpse of a lab coat disappearing around a corner up ahead, he lunged toward it as gravity gave a sudden lurch, tossing debris from the floor to the wall. Colliding with the wall, he tumbled around the turn and slid to a stop. "Wait!" he gasped, crawling forwards, trying to catch up. Making it to his feet, Josh pumped everything into his legs and flew down the corridor. A small group of people had piled up against a security entrance ahead of him. As the reinforced door slid open, they fought and shoved their way through, leaving it open behind them. "Yes!" he thought. The doors began to automatically slide closed. "No!" he shouted, pushing his legs into overdrive, shoving every last ounce of strength through them. He shot towards the door, watching the red-lit opening slowly, inexorably narrowing. "Jesus Christ, please don't let me die," he thought. He hit the 2-foot gap at a sprint, rattled through, and felt the doors pinch his shoe as he hit the floor palms first. Pure split-second reflex ripped his foot clear. The gate shut with a sharp, metallic thud. Josh took mental inventory for a moment, patted down his legs to make sure he was all there, and scrambled to his feet. The red hazard lights blasted the white walls bright scarlet and left deep black shadows lying behind every corner. He thought he could hear people in the distance, yet the intersection was curiously deserted. Josh felt the sudden animal dread of a straggler in the dark. He tried to calm himself by taking deep breaths through his nose and glanced down the hallway ahead, the quickest route to the surface. As he did, a thought struck him, and he turned back to face the doors. Had he truly been the last person out? He peered through the thick guardhouse window and tried to see if anything else was moving. "Hey!" He spun around and a flashlight shone in his face. Holding a hand up, he squinted against the light. Despite the shock, Josh felt himself relax as the security guard lowered his flashlight. The guard shouted something that was lost in the overhead alarm, but Josh made a guess and patted himself, making an OK sign. The guard stepped in and spoke into Josh's ear. "Anyone behind you?" he yelled. Josh shrugged. "I didn't see anyone." The guard nodded and pointed him down the hallway. "Head towards the main exit," he shouted. Josh hesitated for a moment. "What is it?" the guard said. "Get moving." "Are you sure you don't need a hand?" Josh replied. The guard gave him a strange look and shook his head. "Get moving," he yelled, and waved Josh off. Josh gritted his teeth, took one last look at the doors, and headed down the hallway. "Go," he muttered to himself. "Go. Just go." Nora could only half perceive the fleeing crowd around her by the dim flashing hazard lights. Her world was a pitch-dark blur interrupted by flashes of red and the clipped blare of the alarm. "Here," the covering guard said, his digitized voice almost clear above the noise. "Move to the wall. Boss is on his way." Her guard's grip dug into her arm as they adjusted course and moved to the right side of the corridor, coming to a halt. The flowing crowd formed an eddy around them, continuing onwards and beginning to thin somewhat. Nora twisted to loosen the woman's grip, only for her to grab Nora's hand and suddenly bend her wrists. A lance of pain shot up her arm. "Stop!" the woman's voice growled. Nora stopped. Her accent was strange, but the intent was clear. Something moved towards them, causing a ripple in the crowd. Nora watched 3 more fully armed men emerge and join the circle. Nora suddenly noticed that, while each wore McKnight's shoulder patches, their name tags had been removed, and instead each had a call sign scrawled onto the brim of their helmet. From the trio of newcomers, the leader stepped towards Nora and ripped off her hairband, letting her crumpled white bangs fall over her eyes. Nora picked out the word "boss" scrawled above his goggles. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly deep, to the point she thought it might have been altered by the mask. "Looks like our intel was good," he growled. Nora wondered if they had cuffed her as a matter of protocol, or they knew what she could do with her hands free. She was lucky they hadn't found the safety pin she'd clipped inside her sleeve. Still, getting it out was going to be a pain. "Caught her in the control room," said the first guard, who had apparently dubbed himself Missionary. "Looked like she and the research staff were having a disagreement." Boss cocked his head. "A disagreement? She pulled a gun on them," the female guard's mother said in her unplaceable accent. "2, in fact." Nora felt Boss's eyes drilling into her. "Well," he said, "isn't that interesting?" "We don't have time for this," Mother broke in. "We may already have an outbreak on our hands." "Security's on it," said one of the guards. "We've already got people at the doors." His name tag said Ronan. "Check on them," Boss said, turning to Missionary. "Catch any others?" "Nope, just her." "There weren't any others," Nora interrupted. Boss cast her a glance, and she realized she had probably conveyed the opposite. Boss turned back to Missionary. "How close can you get to Ground Zero?" he continued. Missionary shook his head. "Ground Zero's a sucking hole. If they're not with the evacuees, they're not in this universe." "Boss," Ronan said, "I'm not getting a response from the door." Despite the noise, Nora felt a chilling silence within the circle. The last man, Big Red, finally spoke for the first time. "Shit," he muttered, adjusting his grip on his rifle. "I friggin' hate Mondays." "Split up," Boss snapped. "Mother, Missionary, babysitting duty. Ronan." "Hey!" Ronan had slowly migrated away from the circle and stepped down the hall a few feet, apparently studying something in the crowd. "Boss," he said, slowly raising a finger. "Does anybody else see—" A voice, she thought it was Missionary's, suddenly exploded next to her. "Ronan, up! Look up!" A ceiling tile struck Ronan on the head, prompting him to turn his gaze skyward an instant before a black shape dropped through the ceiling and tackled him to the ground. Nora saw a pair of massive jaws open wide and clamp shut like a trap, thrashing back and forth as it tried to rip the man apart. Ronan screamed. Before any of them had a chance to raise their weapons, Boss had barreled through the circle and lashed out with an armored fist, grabbing the creature behind the head. There was a metallic ring as a long blade flipped out from his arm brace and locked straight. She heard something inhuman shriek as he punched the blade through it, once, twice, 3 times. She lost count. He ripped the thing off Ronan and tossed the body away like a smashed tent. A jolt went through her as it hit the floor. She looked straight at the twisted shape on the ground and felt her panic rise as her mind failed to make the thing coalesce into something she could recognize. The faster ideas came, the faster they were tossed away. Bird? She thought. Bug? Alien? Dog? Demon? Dinosaur? She felt her reason slipping away and a primal fear replacing it. A need to run, a need to hide, a need to see the sun. Mother blocked Missionary's move towards the fallen soldier, handing Nora off to him and kneeling at Ronan's side. Pulling out a long white injector from her vest, she popped off the safety cap and stabbed him in the thigh. "Heads up!" Big Red yelled. "Contact front! X-rays mixed with friendlies! They're coming out of the ceiling!" Nora followed his finger down the hall over the heads of the fleeing personnel and only saw blackness beyond the flickering emergency lights. slowly going out, one by one. With a sudden shock, she realized the lights weren't simply going out. They would become partially obscured by something, and then abruptly explode into showers of sparks. Mother muttered something under her breath in a language Nora didn't understand. "Missionary," Boss said. "Talk to me, soldier." "I see him, sir," Missionary said, calm fury settling his voice. Boss withdrew his blade and stood, unslinging his assault rifle. "Red, Missionary," he barked. "Gas him. Watch your fire." Missionary pulled a gas canister from his vest, yanked the pin loose, and let fly, hurling it over the heads of the crowd. It vanished into the black mass beyond. Red's grenade followed swiftly. "Boss!" It was Big Red, hand on radio. "They're all the way up to the main entrance," he shouted. "We're about to be cut off." Boss hesitated and cast a long look at the melee behind them. Green smoke had already started to obscure the scene. Something was moving in the mist, something she couldn't recognize. She tried to look at the thing Boss had killed in the dark, but there were too many people in her way. More shapes were staggering into view, falling to the ground and twitching as people dodged past them. "Boss!" Boss turned to Mother. "Can he move?" "I'll carry him," she replied. "Do it," he said. "I'll take point. Red, watch our rear. Missionary," he jabbed a finger at Nora. "Hold on to her." Nora cast a look backwards as she was hurried off. She saw human figures staggering, and something else. Long, clawed legs writhing in the dark. Banshee cries chased them up the corridor. The thinning crowd ahead of them suddenly exploded into screams of terror, scattering like a flock of birds. "Left! On the left!" Mother shouted. Another jolt went through Nora as what seemed like the entire squad fired their weapons, a shocking staccato explosion that shattered her nerves like a mirror. She screamed as the air itself reverberated and pounded against her. Something huge and inhuman crowed and hit the floor with a thud. Boss stomped its skull flat with a loud crunch, then waved them on. She heard Missionary hissing vague curses through his teeth as they passed. He gave the mangled body a wide berth, but suddenly Nora felt a strange desire to see the thing. She was confused. She didn't understand. Disaster should have meant her death, many deaths, but she had been expecting an explosion of some kind, not... What was happening? Someone slammed into her, and she turned back to find the squad forcing its way through the panicked crowd. Shell-shocked employees were running into them, screaming, shouting, grabbing at them for help, eyes wide with panic. The guards pushed them aside, offering no assistance besides the occasional finger pointed towards the exit. Nora slipped and fell, her hand splashing into something wet and sticky. Missionary hoisted her upright, and then she saw the body, lying face down in a torn lab coat dark with blood. They came up on half a dozen security guards armed with shotguns and pistols. Boss pointed them back and yelled something over the alarm. The leader nodded and waved his men forwards. Nora caught Boss casting a look behind him, watching them disappear into the green smoke. Then, without a second glance, he turned and they strode on towards the exit. Josh was making slow progress. A third of the lights flickered wildly, and the other third had winked out entirely, leaving him stumbling around in the half-dark. As he approached a junction, he saw several people dash through and hurried to follow. "Hey!" he yelled. "Hey, wait up!" Turning the corner, he saw them enter a short inter-building bridge when the lights shorted out. He heard glass breaking and a sheet steel pop as it warped. There were several screams of terror, and then another sound drowned them out. A screech, like a hawk the size of a tiger. A ferocious, rattling sound that stopped him in his tracks. He whirled and sprinted back the way he'd come. Ducking into a restroom, he frantically tried to push the slow door shut, and then backed slowly away into the darkness, flicking on his phone's flashlight and shining it around the dark corners. It was empty, except for an A-frame ladder leading up to a gaping hole in the ceiling tiles. That meant, he thought, his light fell on the toolbox, sitting on the counter by the sink. He leaped for it and frantically threw open the lid, tossing away the tray and digging among the heavy metal implements inside. Ha! He pulled a crowbar from the toolbox, tested its weight, and found it surprisingly handy. Glancing into the mirror, he froze. It was hard to be sure in the dim light, but he thought he had seen something drop from the ceiling. He rubbed his eyes, opened them wide, and leaned over to look at the floor by the ladder. At that instant, something bit him on the ankle. He jumped and immediately tripped over what seemed to be a 2-foot-long madman's conception of a black scorpion. It had clamped onto his left leg. He screamed, thrashed, and kicked, whacking the creature on the ground and trying to scrape it off with his other foot. Somehow he kicked it loose and it went skidding under the sink, hissing furiously. Bracing against the wall, it made a quick turnaround and launched back at his face. Josh slapped it away with a blow from his crowbar and scrambled for the door, yanking it open and wriggling out into the eye-wrenching red of the hallway. Something latched onto his ankle once more. One of the scorpion's huge foreclaws had clamped down like a vise on his pant leg. Josh panicked, imagining that his whole foot was being cut off. He shook and kicked with his other foot, falling over in the process. The thing hissed, and he saw it suddenly contract and curl up, lashing out with its stinger. His eyes bulged, and he whipped the creature against the wall, finally pinning it there with his foot. It writhed and hissed furiously, its tail slapping an angry beat against the wall and floor like a beached fish. Josh managed to prevent himself from instinctively pulling his foot away, freeing the creature. His mind raced. Reaching out with his crowbar, he tried to hit the scorpion with the hooked end, but found it difficult to reach his feet. He grimaced and promised himself he would do more crunches if he ever made it out alive. Leaning forwards, he swung and bounced the crowbar off the bug's head. It hissed at him. He hit it again, and grimaced. He couldn't get the leverage to really smack it. Flipping the crowbar around, he decided to try the pointy end. "Yeah, it's not working for me either," he grunted. "Here, try this." Reaching forwards, he stabbed the scorpion between the head and the carapace and started twisting the blade around. The bug rattled and jerked, chittering and thumping the walls. With a final vicious twist, Josh cranked it into the head, and the bug stiffened, legs twitching slowly. Prying the pincers off, he tested his ankle movement. Everything seemed to be in place. He turned to the carcass and stared at it. "It's all so real," he muttered. A blood-curdling shriek tore down the hall, and he jumped, nearly dropping the crowbar in the process. He briefly heard something clumping in the dark. "Oh, come on," he muttered to himself. "What now, mutant horses?" The lights ahead were gone, the only illumination from the adjoining passage to the left. Josh held his breath, holding the crowbar out ahead of him in a two-fisted death grip. He strained to sift any sound of movement from the blaring alarm. He thought he saw something move in the grainy darkness and stiffened. "Please be something with 2 legs," he whispered. 2 skeletal black forelegs emerged into the light, followed by a frilled skull with jaws like vertical hooked shears. Cocking its head to the side, it looked him over with 3 blank, pearlescent eyes and let its split lower mandibles hang open. It was easily 6 feet tall. "Shit!" he spat, and powered back through the restroom door. The thing let loose an ear-splitting shriek. Josh skidded on the tile floor, reversed direction, and threw himself back against the door just in time to pin the creature's skull against the frame. It screamed again, pushing and scrabbling. Josh braced his feet and fought rising panic. "You panic, you die," he thought. "You panic, you die. God, please don't let me die." The thing gave a push and managed to shove its head inside and curl it around to face Josh. The neck was long and flexible, allowing it to take a sideways snap at him. He jumped back, and it was in. He whacked it in the jaw with his crowbar and dodged deeper into the restroom, the monster hot on his tail. Bouncing off the long countertop, he threw himself forwards, tripped, hit the floor, and became a quadruped, scrambling underneath the nearest stall partition and jerking his legs clear of the snapping jaws. The creature jammed its pincers in after him, then withdrew and began probing with its long, clawed forelegs. Josh stepped up on the toilet and glued himself to the back of the stall. Glancing over the wall into the partition next to him, he hesitated, gritted his teeth, and turned to thrust himself over the gray sheet metal. Something smacked his feet from under him. He lost his grip, felt the wall slide past his hands, and fell straight into the bug's open jaws. Crunch! Josh's head spun. The stench of death filled his mind, and something wet was in his left eye. Suddenly, he realized the bug wasn't moving. Something came to rest on his shoulder, and he exploded, thrashing against the bladed jaws until he managed to flip himself over and put his back to the wall, pinning the bug's mangled skull with his foot. He stared at it. Honestly, it was hard to tell if it was even conscious. The lidless, mercury-silver eyes had no pupils. One of the forelegs rose and fell limply, curling like a squashed spider's. The skull looked bent, and Josh soon noticed a pool of opaque black liquid forming beneath it. Flipping the stall door open with his hand, he dragged himself through and climbed to his feet, taking a look at himself in the mirror. His left shoulder and arm were soaked in stinking black gore, and a long cut bled freely on his forehead. The blood was getting into his eye. He staggered to the sink, plopped his dirty cap on the counter, and turned on the faucets to rinse the mess from his hands. Something nudged his shoulder, and he started. "Oh!" It was Bishop, aviators perfectly in place, holding Josh's dropped crowbar. "What the hell?" Josh barked. "Don't do that." "I'm sorry," Bishop said. "You dropped this." Thanks," Josh replied, pointing to the counter. "Put her there." Bishop set the bar down as Josh continued scrubbing his hands and glanced over at the stall. "That was quite a sight," he said. "You just stood there and watched?" Josh shot back. "It's been a long time since I saw someone kill something like that," Bishop continued. Josh planted his hands against the counter and groaned loudly. "That's right," Bishop said, patting him on the back. "Deep breaths." "Don't touch me," Josh said, pushing his hands away. Who are you anyway? What's going on?" "You really can't stop here," Bishop said. "You have to keep moving." "Why?" Josh said. What is the underground hurricane going to suck everything into hell or whatever?" "No," Bishop said. "But there's someone you need to find. And fast." Josh stopped. "Who?" "I think you'll know her when you see her." Josh stared at him for a moment. "What?" He ran out of words. "So, she really hit me?" Bishop cocked his head. then flicked his finger against Josh's forehead. Ow! Josh barked. What did you do that for? Are you awake? Bishop said. I have a cut there, Josh growled. Take the first left when you walk out, Bishop said, turning towards the exit. Just follow the lights. What? Josh said, squinting out of his blood-caked eye. Where do you think you're going? Bishop ignored him and rounded the corner. Josh snatched up his hat and crowbar, limping after him. Hooking the rapidly closing door with his hand, he stepped out into the hallway. He looked both ways, peering into the dark. Bishop was nowhere to be seen. Oh, come on, he muttered. Noticing the adjoining left hallway still had lighting, he looked down to the end and saw blinking bulbs continuing for some distance. He took one last glance behind him, adjusted his grip on the crowbar, and started jogging. The going had been slow, with Mother lugging Ronan and his equipment. Nora squeezed her eyes shut and tried vainly to block out the ringing in her ears as Missionary hurried her along, one arm looped through hers. They had made a detour and suddenly found themselves alone, with only the occasional dead body to keep them company. It was by no means silent with the alarm overhead, but compared to the chaos of before, it was unnervingly calm. Nora was confused. She had tried not to think about what would happen if they failed. To be honest, she hadn't really known. Mr. E had never explained it. She just knew there would be consequences if they did. Earth-shattering consequences. Reality-shattering consequences. She had hoped she wouldn't be around to find out what that meant. As they came to a left turn, Boss raised his fist and pulled up short. The others jerked to a stop. For a moment, Nora wondered what they were doing. Oh, shit, Missionary hissed. At first, all she could perceive was a constant rumbling thunder, like a stampede somewhere in an adjacent hallway. She hadn't heard it while the other evacuees had been running beside them, but now that they were alone, she could hear it, rising, mixed with a curious high-pitched chittering, and then the sound burst into sudden clarity from the hallway to their left. All heads immediately turned towards it, weapons snapped to invisible vectors trailing off into the scarlet gloom, ending in a roiling black mass of rangy limbs pouring into the hallway. Nora caught her breath. It filled the corridor from floor to ceiling in seconds, then vanished as it hit the overhead light, which popped in a flash of sparks. Weapons free, Boss growled. 4 muzzle flashes blasted the darkness away, and an inhuman cacophony of screams exploded from the mass. Nora wished she could turn away, wished there was some way she could close her ears to the barrage of sounds as streams of white tracers lanced into the black. Blazing automatic fire lit up the approaching wall of claws and chitinous limbs in strobing flashes, branding ghostly images of snapping jaws and flashing blades onto the back of her eyes. Limbs and splashes of black gore pinwheeled through the air as if a giant weed-eater had been taken to a hedge. Carapaces burst on impact, splattering gore everywhere. Missionary! Red! Boss bellowed. Frags and gas! Nora felt herself shaken as Missionary pulled something from his vest, passed it to his free hand, and hucked it down the hallway. Frag out! He yelled hoarsely. Gas out! Nora tensed for an eternal instant, and the grenade went off, the shockwaves slamming into her as the crack of the explosion thundered down the hall. She pried her eyelids open and looked. At first it seemed like nothing had happened, and then she realized the mass was shifting differently. Its advance had been stalled, the front ranks reduced to piles of bloody mulch. The rear was now forced to dig through the bodies of their compatriots to continue the fight. Green gas filtered up through the bugs, and they too began to wilt, going into spasms, flipping and jerking, curling up like massive contorted burrs as they tumbled through breaks in the walls of the dead, only to join its ramparts. More! Behind us! Mother shouted, bringing Nora back to reality. We've got to go! Right! Right! Boss stabbed his hand to the side. Knock it down! Go! 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 Nora felt herself drawn away by Big Red as Missionary crossed the hallway to the right, braced himself, and kicked the sheetrock wall in with a single blow. Turning, he grabbed Nora and pushed through the new door he'd made. The others streamed in behind him and rapidly began piling file cabinets and other furniture to block the entrance. Already she could hear the enemy nearly on top of them, growling and hissing. Red jammed his weapon through a narrow gap in the barricade and hosed the attackers to furious hissing. The next room! Boss shouted, and they piled through the far door. Boss shut it firmly as Red backed through. The lights suddenly flickered and sprang to life, bleaching the room a greenish white. It was one of the labs, wide and full of tables packed with instruments. Boss pointed towards Mother. Lieutenant, fine, sir, Red interrupted. Security's on the line. Boss put his hand to his earpiece. Who am I talking to? Sergeant Donaldson, Red said. In security control. On the surface? Boss said. What happened to... He stopped himself and put his hand to his ear. Control? Control, this is Hazard Actual. Lieutenant, calm down and... Nora watched as Mother laid Ronan carefully onto his back, reaching a hand under his helmet to check his pulse. Well, then that means you're in charge, Boss said. Nothing with more than 2 legs gets past that gate, understand? I said, do you understand? Another pause. Good, he said. Hazard out. He put his hand down and turned to Missionary. Security retook the main door, but Lieutenant Patterson is dead. He pointed out the door they'd come from. That means some of us need to stay and tangle this flow up here. Lieutenant, missionary, take Ronan and— Booker's dead, Mother interrupted. The alarm blared. No one spoke. Missionary, Boss said in a low voice. Take the girl and join the evac. Mother, Red, you're coming with me. Aye, Boss, Missionary said, grabbing Nora's arm. Oh, and Foster, Boss said. Yeah, Boss? Don't take any chances. Aye, sir. Nora was staring at Ronan's body when she saw an armored hand suddenly reach out in front of her and snap its fingers. Hey, Missionary said. Wake up, we gotta go. She blinked and stared at him. Give me your arm, he said, reaching out for her elbow. Nora pulled away and he grabbed her other arm instead. Hey! She blurted. He paid no attention, hefting his weapon in his right hand and looping his left under her arm. Listen, he muttered. You want to live? You come with me. Let's go. He kicked open the opposite door, looked both ways, and stepped out into the next corridor. Freeze! Josh pulled up short and held up his hands as a flashlight beam stabbed him in the face. A security guard stepped out from the shadows, a leveled M4 in his hands. Show me your hands, he shouted. Put the weapon down. What? Oh, Josh slowly set the crowbar down. Is that your ID? The guard said. Let me see it. Josh slowly reached down and pulled the tag from his coveralls, holding it out for inspection. The flashlight beam shifted to the laminated card, allowing him to see somewhat. Another flashlight beam poked his retinas. Ah, Josh muttered. We're all on the same side. Keep your hands up, a second voice ordered. Don't move. Josh was starting to feel nervous, like a kid with his back to a dark closet. Guys, he said. Listen, He looked over his shoulder. I said freeze! Don't move! Okay, Josh said. Okay, I'm not moving. The first officer scraped blood off the tag and compared it to Josh's face several times. Who is he? The second guard said. What's that smell? The first guard squinted at Josh and shined the flashlight in his face again. Whoa! Is that your blood or someone else's? The second officer demanded. Mine, Josh replied. Bullshit, said the first guard. That's way too much for you to still be walking around. Well, not all of it's mine, Josh admitted, immediately regretting it. What? The first guard said. I thought you said it was yours. No, you don't understand, Josh tried to explain. Look closer, it's not red, see? Both guards stepped back. What is that stuff? Said the second. Josh floundered for words. Look, I'm a janitor, okay? I was working, I got this stuff on me. I'm just looking for the exit. Oh yeah? The second guard snapped. Then what was a crowbar for? Sir, said the first guard, I'm gonna need you to come with us. Josh's brows drew together. What's going on? Quarantine protocol's in effect, the second guard replied. Keep your hands where I can see them, and try not to touch that stuff on your clothes. Is it dangerous? Josh said. You're gonna be fine, the first guard said, pulling a set of handcuffs from his belt. Now please come with us. What are those for? Josh asked. They're for your safety, the guard said, kicking the crowbar aside. Josh and the guards exited the building facade into the bare and sparsely lit tunnel section in front of the main door. It was packed from wall to wall with terrified employees and the occasional security officer. Oh, great, said the first guard. We're gonna have to push our way through that? Quit your whining, said the second, yanking Josh's arm. Ow, complained Josh. The guard's yanking was rubbing the cuffs on his wrists. He looked down at them. He'd never really been cuffed before. It felt wrong. Several guards were herding the mass of nervous civilians through to the series of company buses parked just outside in the main access tunnel. The first guard raised his flashlight and started pushing his way through. Josh felt a nudge on his back and began walking forwards into the crowd. He sighed. At least he'd made it out. As he looked back up, he suddenly felt a chill along his spine and spun around. Bishop materialized out of the crowd, wearing a guard's uniform, and tapped the second guard on the shoulder. Excuse me, he said. Could you look there, please? The guard, as if noticing something, turned and looked intently at the ceiling. Josh stared at Bishop open-mouthed as he produced a key, unlocked the handcuffs, and allowed them to drop to the floor with a clatter. Don't get on the buses, Bishop said, and turned to point back the way they'd come. Take the first left, then straight on. Josh regained speech control. What? Bishop jabbed his finger towards the door. Straight and then a left, he said. Now hurry, before the other one spots you. Josh spun and saw the first guard starting to look around. He was several people ahead and had apparently lost them. Wait a minute. Josh turned back to Bishop. Who? He was already gone. Josh scowled, cast a glance over his shoulder, and pushed his way back towards the door. Nora clenched her fists and concentrated, pulling her arms apart for the third time. Nothing. She gritted her teeth. Holding the safety pin in her bloody hand was difficult enough without trying to find a tiny plastic tab. She kept expecting to run into Cthulhu around the next turn. Maybe she already had. She had to get away, find her friends, know if they were still alive. It didn't seem like it would be too hard. Escape, followed by blending into the crowd, and then she'd slip away among the survivors. Tina had to still be receiving her, though nobody had talked in quite a while. If they had any brains, they'd have split already, she thought. That would complicate trying to find them. She immediately remanded herself for thinking that. Of course they'd stay. They were a team out to save the world. Who wanted to run away from that? Me, she thought. Missionary turned a corner and stopped short, jerking his weapon to his shoulder. Nora looked up. It was Josh Murphy. Oh, good, she thought. Now we can all die together. Josh threw up his hands. Whoa, 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 hold up, don't shoot, he sputtered. Josh? The armored man's voice grated through his mask. Josh recognized the exoskeleton. Foster? He said. Yeah, Foster said, flipping his mask up. You're going the wrong way, man. The exit is that way. I know, Josh said. Foster wrinkled his nose. What's all that stuff on you? Josh couldn't figure out how to answer that. I fell on a bug, he thought. It was shitty. He glanced at Nora. She looked more than a little shell-shocked and didn't seem to be paying the least attention to him. He wasn't sure whether to be angry or relieved. He began again. There was a bug? Foster finished. Are you okay? Josh blinked. Yeah, I'm fine, he said. How'd you know I fell on a bug? Because we're drowning in the bastards, Foster said. Listen, man, stick with us. I don't want to bury anybody else today. People are dead? Josh replied. Are you sure I'm not on drugs, or... Josh found his thought process cut short as Foster grabbed him by the collar and looked into his eyes. Jeez, he snapped. What are you doing? You're fine, Foster said. You're officially deputized. Josh felt the butt of Foster's USP-45 being shoved into his hands and tried not to drop it as Foster turned away and dragged Nora up. What's happening? Josh muttered. I said you're deputized, Foster repeated. Say it back to me. Josh stared at him blankly. I'm deputized? Good enough, Foster said. Hold her. He shoved Nora at Josh, who automatically looped an arm through hers and averted the muzzle of his pistol. She turned her head lazily and gave him a cold look. He swallowed hard. Josh, meet Nora, meet Josh, Foster muttered, hefting his carbine. Let's go. Stay right on my tail. Maybe I should... Josh tried to think of something else to say and couldn't. He turned to look at Nora again and found her looking back. Her expression was strained but otherwise impenetrable. He forced a smile. So, how was your morning? In lieu of a response, she turned sharply and kicked him in the nuts. He dropped to his knees. She was off and running before he had recovered enough to speak. That bad, huh? He hissed through his teeth. Nora turned to see Foster sprinting after her. She saw a stairwell door on her right and quickly shouldered through it. Spinning to face the door, she worked frantically at the cuffs. She'd spent the past 10 minutes trying to jam the tip of the safety pin into the zip tie's ratchet, and she thought she'd finally... The cuffs loosened. She ripped her hands free. She made a fist with her right and took a deep breath. Energy built like a charge within her. She cocked her arm back like an archer and held it taut, waiting. The door's narrow window darkened slightly. The instant she heard the latch rattle, she let fly. A bolt of kinetic energy split the air, slamming the door into her pursuer's face. She heard a grunt of pain and grinned in spite of herself. Foster kicked the door so hard that it rebounded off the wall and nearly came off its hinges. Foster stepped through and looked up. Nora was already 2 flights above them, pounding up the steps as fast as she could. He turned to see Josh stumbling in after him, doubled over. She got away, Josh croaked. Not yet, she hasn't, Foster replied. Let's go. He leaped forwards and took the steps 2 at a time. Deciding he didn't want to be left at the bottom of the stairs with whatever was lurking in the hallway, Josh took the steps as fast as he could, which wasn't very fast at all. He arrived at the top of the steps to find Foster halfway through the doorway to the 3rd floor. He spoke up. Hey, shh! Foster cut him off, holding up a hand. Looking for what Foster was looking at, Josh's gaze roved around the inside of the white beige carpeted hallway beyond. This floor was mostly boardrooms. The walls were old and wood-paneled, and the air was musty and dry. The alarms blaring reached them only faintly from the lower floors. Either this floor's circuits hadn't been updated, or the alarm had malfunctioned somehow. Foster stepped carefully out into the hallway, his footsteps almost completely absorbed into the carpet. It felt strange, Josh thought, the tranquility of the moment, like disturbing a tomb in an earthquake. Foster turned to face Josh and swept his hand to the left. Take those, he whispered. I'll take these. He pointed right. Wait, Josh said. What? Have you got any more mags? Josh said, holding up his pistol. You're not supposed to shoot her, Foster replied. That's not what I'm worried about. Josh glanced back down the stairs. Foster looked at him thoughtfully, then pulled 2 pistol magazines from his vest and handed them over. Josh stuffed them into his pockets. "Thanks," he said, and turned to the left. Keeping the weapon raised, he opened the nearest door. The long boardroom was empty. Checking under the table, he noticed the door at the opposite end of the room was open. He headed for it, treading softly. He found himself in another boardroom. At first, he didn't notice anything strange, but after a moment, he noticed that the drop ceiling had been noticeably wrecked near the far end of the room. Panels ripped out and scattered over the floor. He immediately crouched, clicked on the USP's attached flashlight, and scanned the floor for scorpions. He was in no mood to get into another wrestling match with an overgrown mutant lobster. The things were probably radioactive or something. He was still wrapping his mind around those. The smaller one was obviously some sort of mutant scorpion, but he had no idea what the other thing was. Some kind of crazy pterodactyl-bug. They were loud, too. Not very bug-like. Like something out of a nightmare. All of it was. He was starting to wonder if he weren't hallucinating the whole thing. This state of mind was not improved when he stood up just in time to see Nora fall through the ceiling. She hit the tabletop, rolled off the far side, and jumped to her feet, assuming a fighting stance. They sized each other up. "That looked like it hurt," Josh said. Nora tried to hide a wince. "It did," she replied. Josh glanced at the door and wondered what he should do next. He glanced up at the new hole in the ceiling, then looked back at the dusty girl in front of him. "How did you get up?" She cut him off with a punch to the jaw from 6 feet away. The bolt of kinetic energy smashed into his already bruised nose and he stumbled back, dazed. He threw up his arms and felt the next 2 bolts slam into them. Opening his eyes, he saw her leap onto the table and launch herself onto a chair to his right, which rolled out from under her. She flipped and landed with a thud. Josh almost threw himself across the room and shoved the chair aside. He dragged Nora upright and wrapped her in a bear hug from behind, keeping hold of her wrists. "Just calm down for a second," he barked. He saw the air shimmer, felt the hairs on his arms stand up, and then she snapped the back of her head into his nose. His vision exploded into bright blobs, and the world spun. Nora pushed away from Josh and scrabbled away on all 4s, launching herself towards the doorway. As she pushed herself to her feet, still moving forwards, she slammed head-on into something large and metal. Stars and nebulas burst in front of her eyes, and she fell to the floor, clutching her head. A pair of steel-braced combat boots appeared in front of her, and a reinforced glove met the back of her neck, forcing her flat. Foster let out an awed, sympathetic groan, tempered by a repressed half-chuckle. "Oh, damn, that looked like it hurt." Nora clutched her aching head and growled helplessly into the carpet.